The wind cut like broken glass that December night in the city. Each gust a reminder that nature showed no mercy to the forgotten, no matter what they had already endured. Richard Holloway's voice still rang in Caroline Brooks' ears as she stumbled through the darkened streets. His final words sharp as the cold biting her face. "You're nothing. You'll always be nothing. And I'll make sure everyone knows it." The security guard had escorted her out the back exit. The one without cameras. The one where things happened that nobody wanted recorded. Her cardboard box of belongings had been dumped in the snow-covered parking lot. Her work badge snapped in half and tossed after it like garbage. Caroline stood there in the employee lot that nobody used after dark, her grandmother's burgundy coat wrapped tight around her shaking frame, watching her breath form desperate clouds in the frozen air. She had $73 in her pocket. No apartment to return to. The eviction had been yesterday. No friends to call. She had burned those bridges trying to survive. No family left. Her grandmother's grave was the only place that had felt like home in 8 years, and you couldn't sleep on a headstone. She turned toward the street, toward the shelters that would already be full, toward another night of choosing between frostbite and predators, when she heard it through the screaming wind. A sound that didn't belong to the storm. A child's cry, thin and terrified, barely audible above the blizzard's roar. That if this story touched your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to believe in kindness today. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next. Caroline's frozen fingers fumbled with her phone. The screen showed 9% battery, no signal. She followed the sound anyway, her boots crunching through snow that was already erasing her footprints as fast as she made them. The crying led her deeper into Riverside Park, past the locked playground, past the frozen fountain, into a service area behind the maintenance shed where normal people never went. And there they were. 2 children huddled against a brick wall, half buried in snow that had drifted against them like a burial shroud. The boy, maybe 6 years old, had his arms wrapped around a smaller girl who had stopped shivering, stopped moving. Both wore designer winter coats that should have been enough, but were soaked through from hours in the storm. Their lips were blue. Their skin had gone waxy and pale. The boy looked up at Caroline with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. "Please," he whispered through chattering teeth. "Please help her. Sophia won't wake up. The bad men came and our guard told us to run and hide. And we did, but she won't wake up and I don't know what to do." Caroline dropped to her knees in the snow. Her hands, rough from years of manual labor, scarred from things she tried not to remember, reached for the little girl's throat, searching for a pulse. There. Faint. Too faint. The child was minutes from death. They both were. She looked at the boy, at his desperate faith that an adult could fix this, that help had finally arrived. She thought about the $73 that wouldn't buy her a night in a decent motel, about the shelters that were full, about the abandoned basement 5 miles away where she'd been squatting, where she might survive the night if she left right now. Then she looked down at her coat. The burgundy wool coat with the silk lining, hand-sewn by her grandmother during the final months of cancer treatment. The coat whose inner pocket still held the note stitched in careful letters. "You are stronger than you know, and more loved than you believe." The coat that had kept her alive through 2 winters on the streets. The coat that still smelled faintly of lavender sachets and Sunday dinners, and everything she had lost. The coat that was warm. "What are you doing?" the boy asked as Caroline's numb fingers worked the buttons. She didn't answer. Couldn't answer. If she spoke, she might think about what she was doing. Might calculate that giving away this coat in this storm was a death sentence. Might choose survival over 2 children she didn't know. She pulled the coat off. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Her thin work shirt and cheaper jacket underneath were no match for the blizzard. She could already feel the hypothermia that had been lurking at the edges starting to creep toward her core. "No," the boy protested, pushing weakly at her hands. "You'll freeze. You'll die." Caroline wrapped the coat around both children, tucking it carefully around the unconscious girl, pulling the boy close against his sister. The burgundy wool still held her body heat. She watched it surround them like an embrace, like her grandmother's arms, like love made visible. "I live nearby," Caroline lied, her voice already slurring from the cold invading her system. "Just a few blocks. I'll get help." You don't, the boy said, and somehow he knew. This small child could see through her the way children always could. But he was also 6 years old and his sister was dying, so he stopped arguing. Caroline lifted the girl into her arms, so light, too light, and began walking. Each step was agony. Each breath felt like inhaling knives. She made it to the park entrance where the streetlights still worked, where cars occasionally passed. She laid the children under the bus shelter, used the emergency phone to call 911, and waited with them, her arms around their bundled forms, singing, "You Are My Sunshine," in a voice that cracked and faded. The same song her grandmother had sung during chemotherapy. The same song she had hummed to herself on the worst nights to remember that someone had once loved her. When sirens finally wailed in the distance, when she saw the ambulance lights painting the snow red and white, Caroline slipped away. The boy called after her, his voice strong again now that warmth was returning. "Wait. What's your name? Who are you?" But Caroline was already stumbling back into the storm, a ghost who had learned long ago that people like her didn't get to stay in warm places, didn't get to explain, didn't get to matter beyond the moment of their usefulness. She made it 4 blocks before her legs folded. She crawled another half block toward the basement that might as well have been on the moon. Then she couldn't crawl anymore. She lay down in the snow in an alley behind a closed restaurant, and thought perhaps this wasn't the worst way to go. Cold and alone, yes. But knowing that somewhere 2 children were warm, because of her. Because of the coat her grandmother had made with hands that shook from chemotherapy, but never wavered in their love. Because Caroline Brooks had finally done something that mattered. She closed her eyes as the snow continued to fall, each flake a tiny dagger, and didn't feel it when her heart began to slow. Didn't feel the frostbite claiming her fingers and toes. Didn't feel the world ending. She didn't know that those children belonged to Manuel Cordero, the most feared crime lord in the city, a man who hadn't smiled since his wife's murder 3 years ago. A man who had razed entire organizations to the ground for lesser offenses than threatening his family. She didn't know that Manuel's security team would find the children within minutes, wrapped in a coat that carried a stranger's warmth and a dead woman's love. She didn't know that when the paramedics would cut that coat away to treat the hypothermic children, they would find the note stitched in the lining, and Manuel Cordero would read those words. "You are stronger than you know, and more loved than you believe." And something in his frozen heart would crack. She didn't know that Manuel would mobilize every resource, every contact, every soldier in his empire with a single command. "Find her. Find the woman who saved my children. And bring her to me alive." She didn't know that in 23 minutes his men would discover her body in the alley, pulse barely detectable, core temperature at 78 degrees, minutes from death. She didn't know that Manuel Cordero would carry her into the emergency room himself, still wearing the burgundy coat that had saved his children, and would tell the doctors with quiet menace, "You will save her life, or I will burn this hospital to the ground and build a new one with your ashes." All Caroline knew, in those final moments of consciousness, was that for once in her cruel, beautiful, heartbreaking life, she had been enough. She had mattered. She had loved. And sometimes, when the world is cold and dark and merciless, that has to be enough. But this was not the end of Caroline Brooks' story. This was only the beginning. The blizzard arrived like God's own fury, transforming the city into a white hell where nothing human could survive for long. Caroline had been turned away from 3 shelters already. 2 full, fire code violations, try somewhere else. And her phone had died 2 hours ago, taking with it the last connection between her and the world that had forgotten her. Her lips had gone numb first, then blue. She could see them in the dark windows of closed shops as she passed, a corpse walking, already halfway to dead. Her thoughts kept slipping sideways, fragmenting like ice breaking apart. She would think about finding the basement where she'd been squatting, then forget mid-step what she'd been thinking about. Then remember again with a jolt of animal panic that made her stumble forward through snow that was now past her knees. The cold had stopped hurting. That was the dangerous part. Caroline knew enough about hypothermia from 2 winters on the streets to understand that when the pain stops, when everything goes soft and dreamy, you're entering the final stage. The stage where you lie down and don't get up. Where the cold becomes a lullaby singing you toward darkness that feels like mercy. She had almost accepted it. almost let herself sink down into a doorway and close her eyes. Almost given the city one more frozen body for the morning crews to scrape off the sidewalk with the snow. Then she heard it. Faint and desperate through the howling wind, a child crying. Caroline's frozen brain struggled to process the sound. Hallucination, probably. Hypothermia could do that, make you hear things that weren't there. But her feet were already moving toward it anyway, pulled by some instinct deeper than logic, older than self-preservation. The crying led her off the sidewalk, through the locked gates of Riverside Park that someone had pried open, past the playground equipment buried in drifts, toward the maintenance area where the park workers stored equipment nobody cared about. She found them in the service alcove behind a brick wall. Two small shapes huddled together, already half buried by the accumulating snow. The boy, maybe 6, dark hair plastered to his skull, had his arms wrapped around a little girl who had stopped moving. Both wore winter coats that should have been adequate. Designer labels Caroline recognized from window shopping in her old life, but the coats were soaked through, useless, frozen stiff. The boy's eyes found hers, wide and terrified and barely focused. "Please," he whispered, his voice so quiet she had to lean close to hear. "Please help her. Sophia won't wake up. The bad men came and Raphael tried to hide us like Mama said before she. But Sophia won't wake up and I'm so cold and I don't know what to do." Caroline dropped to her knees in the snow, her hands, clumsy, nearly useless with cold, reaching for the little girl's throat. The pulse was there but fading fast, weak and irregular. The child's lips were blue-gray, her skin waxy and pale. Both children were minutes from death. Maybe less. The calculation came instantly, brutal in its clarity. Her coat, her grandmother's burgundy wool coat with its silk lining and careful stitches, held enough residual warmth to save them. Without it, in her thin jacket and work shirt, Caroline would be dead within the hour. Maybe 30 minutes if she tried to walk anywhere. She looked at the boy, at his desperate faith that an adult could fix this, that the universe was still a place where help arrived when you needed it most. She thought about her grandmother's hands shaking from chemotherapy, but never stopping as she sewed this coat, stitch by careful stitch, love made tangible and warm. She thought about the note hidden in the lining. "You are stronger than you know, and more loved than you believe." Her fingers found the buttons. The boy watched her with confused, fading eyes. "What are you doing?" he asked as she shrugged the coat off, as the cold hit her like a physical blow that knocked the air from her lungs. She didn't answer. She wrapped the coat around both children, tucking it tight, pulling them close together so they could share what warmth remained. The burgundy wool surrounded them like an embrace, like her grandmother's arms, like every moment of love Caroline had ever known made visible and real. "No," the boy protested weakly, trying to push it back toward her. "You'll freeze. You'll die." "I live close," Caroline lied through chattering teeth, already unable to feel her fingers or toes. "Just a few blocks. I'll get help and come back." She pulled them deeper under the overhang where the snow couldn't reach as easily, creating a small shelter with her own body. Then she began to sing, her voice cracked and failing, the song her grandmother had sung during the worst nights in the hospital. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine, you make me happy when skies are gray." The boy's eyes began to close. Caroline shook him gently. "Stay awake, Raphael. Stay with your sister. Help is coming. I promise help is coming." She didn't know if it was true. Didn't know if anyone would find them in time. But she kept singing anyway, kept breathing warmth onto their small faces, kept giving them everything she had left to give. As hypothermia claimed her thoughts, as the world went soft and distant and strangely peaceful, Caroline made peace with it. If this was how her story ended, cold and alone and anonymous, at least it ended with meaning. At least the last thing she did in this cruel, beautiful world was save 2 children who deserved to grow up, who deserved warmth and safety and all the chances Caroline had never gotten. The measure of a soul, she thought as darkness began to creep in from the edges, is not what we possess when we have everything. It's what we're willing to give when we have nothing left. Caroline woke to warmth. That was the first shock. Heat against her skin, soft fabric against her body, air that didn't burn her lungs with cold. For a moment she thought she had died, that hypothermia had finally claimed her, and this was whatever came after. Then the pain hit, sharp and comprehensive, every nerve ending screaming back to life. And she knew with certainty that the dead don't hurt like this. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to soft light instead of the harsh fluorescence of emergency rooms or the darkness of alleys. Private hospital room. Cream walls. Machines beeping steadily beside her bed. And 4 in her arm. Warm blankets piled on top of her. And by the door, a woman with steel gray hair and a face like carved granite, watching her with the alert stillness of a predator. "You're awake," the woman said. Not a question. Her voice carried an accent Caroline couldn't place. Italian, maybe, or Spanish. "Don't try to sit up. You've been unconscious for 3 days. Your body nearly shut down completely." Caroline's throat felt like sandpaper. "The children," she croaked. "Raphael and Sophia. Are they alive?" The woman's expression softened fractionally. "Because of you. Full recovery expected. They've been asking for you every hour since they woke up. Won't stop talking about the angel who gave them her coat." She stood, moving to pour water from a pitcher beside the bed. "I'm Lucia, head of security for the Cordero family. I'm the one who found you in that alley, 23 minutes after we found the children. Another 5 minutes and you'd have been dead." The water helped, though Caroline's hands shook too badly to hold the cup herself. Lucia supported it with surprising gentleness. "Hypothermia. Severe pneumonia. Malnutrition. The doctors said you'd been surviving on maybe 800 calories a day for months. They want to know how you were even walking, let alone carrying a child through a blizzard." Caroline closed her eyes, remembering the weight of Sophia in her arms, Raphael's terrified face, the cold eating her alive from the inside out. "I had to. They would have died." "Yes," Lucia said simply. "They would have. And you chose to save them anyway, knowing it would probably kill you." Something shifted in her granite expression. "My employer wishes to speak with you. Are you strong enough?" Before Caroline could answer, the door opened. A man entered, and the air in the room changed. He wasn't what Caroline expected. No expensive suit, no obvious displays of power. Just jeans and a black sweater, dark hair disheveled. 3 days of stubble shadowing a jaw carved from sharp angles and exhaustion. But his eyes told a different story. Dark brown, almost black, holding depths of violence and grief that made Caroline's breath catch. Manuel Cordero looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, who had forgotten how to sleep, who had been to hell and dragged himself back by sheer force of will. He crossed the room and did something Caroline never expected. He knelt beside her bed, bringing himself to her eye level, making himself vulnerable in a way that felt wrong for a man who commanded empires built on fear. "You gave me back my children." His voice cracked on the words, raw and unguarded. "You saved Raphael and Sophia when you had every reason to save yourself. You wrapped them in your coat, in your warmth, in your love, and you were willing to die for 2 children you'd never met." Caroline's throat tightened. She wanted to look away from the intensity in his eyes, but found she couldn't. Anyone would have. "No." The word came out harsh, absolute. "No, they wouldn't have. I've spent 3 years learning exactly what people will do when it costs them nothing. When it costs them something small. When it costs them everything." His hands gripped the bed rail, knuckles white. "You gave everything. I will spend the rest of my life ensuring you never suffer again. Whatever you need, whatever you want, it's yours." Something in Caroline broke at those words. Pride maybe, or the last shred of dignity she'd been clinging to. "I don't want your money," she said, hearing her own voice turn sharp, defensive. "I don't want your pity or your guilt or whatever this is. I did what needed to be done. That's all." Manuel's eyes flashed with something fierce and unnameable. For a moment Caroline thought she'd angered him. This dangerous man whose world she'd stumbled into. Then his expression shifted into something that might have been respect. "Good," he said quietly. "Because I'm offering neither. I'm not offering charity or pity. I'm offering a debt that can never be repaid, only honored. You gave my children life. Everything I have, everything I am, is now in service of making sure you survive, you thrive, you get back everything this world has stolen from you." He paused, something vulnerable flickering across his face. "I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you what will happen. The only choice you have is whether to accept it with grace or fight me every step of the way. But either way, Caroline Brooks, you will never be cold again. You will never be hungry again. You will never be alone again. Tears burned behind Caroline's eyes. She wanted to argue, to refuse, to protect herself from the inevitable betrayal that came when you accepted help from powerful men. But she was so tired. So broken. And somewhere in this building, 2 children were asking for her. Children who had looked at her with trust she didn't deserve and hope she couldn't fulfill. The children, she whispered. Can I see them? Manuel's expression softened, transformed. They've been waiting for nothing else. He stood and Caroline saw Lucia smile. Actually smile, for the first time. But first you need to understand something. True generosity expects nothing in return. You proved that. But true gratitude cannot remain silent. I will honor what you did, what you gave, what you sacrificed. Not because you demand it, but because anything less would dishonor the gift you gave my family. He moved toward the door then paused. Welcome back to the world of the living, Caroline. I promise you, this time it will be different. Caroline insisted on leaving the hospital after 5 days, despite the doctor's protests about pneumonia and recovery protocols, and a list of medications she couldn't pronounce. Manuel had arranged an apartment. Small, he said, nothing extravagant, just somewhere safe while she figured out what came next. She accepted because pride was a luxury she could no longer afford, and because refusing felt like spitting on the gift she'd given his children. She never made it to the apartment. The attack came in the hospital parking garage. 3 men with dead eyes and practiced efficiency. They grabbed her before she could scream, before Lucia, who had stepped away to bring the car around, could react. Caroline remembered a cloth over her mouth, chemical sweetness burning her nose. Then nothing. She woke for the second time in a week, disoriented and in pain, but this time the room was different. Stone walls. Arch windows. The kind of architecture that whispered old money and older violence. A fortress, not a hospital. Manuel sat beside her bed, and the rage in his eyes was so absolute, so consuming, that Caroline understood for the first time what it meant to be his enemy. Victor Russo, he said, voice flat and final as a death sentence. Sent his men to take you. To send me a message written in your blood. His hands were clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. They didn't succeed. You're in my compound now. You're safe here. You'll stay safe here. It wasn't a request. The children came next, bursting through the door with the kind of energy only the young and newly saved possess. Raphael reached her first, careful and serious, his small hand finding hers. You're the angel, he said, as if this explained everything. You gave us your coat. You sang to us. I told Papa you were real, that you weren't a dream. Sophia climbed onto the bed with less caution, her small body warm and solid against Caroline's side. You smell like my mama did, she whispered. Like safe. Are you staying with us now? Papa says you're staying. Raphael says you're staying. I want you to stay. Caroline looked at Manuel over their dark heads, and saw something complicated move across his face. Hope and fear and desperate protectiveness all tangled together. I don't know what I'm doing yet, she told the children honestly, because they deserved honesty. But I'm here now. That's enough for now, isn't it? The days that followed revealed Manuel's world in layers. Antonio arrived first, Manuel's older brother, silver at his temples, eyes that calculated angles and threats with mathematical precision. He studied Caroline like a problem to be solved, skepticism radiating from every measured word. My brother is making decisions with his heart instead of his head, he said during their first conversation, blunt and unapologetic. I need to know you're not a threat. I need to know you're not using those children to get close to us, to destroy us from the inside. Caroline met his gaze without flinching. I was homeless and dying. I had nothing to gain and everything to lose. I gave away my coat because children were freezing to death, not because I was running some elaborate con. If you can't see that, then you're not as smart as you think you are. Antonio stared at her for a long moment, then laughed, actual, genuine laughter. Okay, maybe you'll survive here after all. Father Tomas came next, a priest with kind eyes and calloused hands who had somehow maintained his faith while serving as spiritual advisor to a crime family. He sat with Caroline in the compound's chapel, a small room with stained glass windows that painted everything in colored light. "You're wondering how I reconcile this," he said, gesturing to encompass the compound, the armed guards outside, the violence implicit in everything. "How a man of God serves men of violence." Caroline nodded, grateful he'd voiced the question she'd been afraid to ask. "Because people are not their worst moments," Father Tomas said simply. "Manuel has done terrible things. His men have done terrible things. But they also protect hundreds of families in this city who have nowhere else to turn. They fund schools and medical clinics in neighborhoods the government has abandoned. They follow a code, harsh yes, but a code nonetheless, that protects the vulnerable within their sphere." He paused, his expression thoughtful. "The world is not black and white, Caroline. It's every shade of gray. And sometimes those society has condemned carry more honor than those it celebrates." She met the soldiers next. Men with names like Diego and Marcus and James. Men with prison tattoos and scarred knuckles and eyes that had seen too much. They were polite to her, almost courtly, these killers and enforcers. They played cards with Raphael in the evenings, teaching him strategy with the same patience they might use to teach him violence. They braided Sophia's hair with surprising gentleness, calling her princessa, treating her like something precious and breakable. One evening, Caroline found Diego, a man built like a tank with a knife scar running down his face, reading Sophia a bedtime story, his rough voice gentling around the fairy tale words. When he saw Caroline watching, he shrugged. "My daughter would be about her age," he said quietly. "If I'd made different choices. If I'd been a different man." He closed the book carefully. "I can't get that back. Can't undo what I've done. But I can make sure these kids grow up safe. That counts for something, doesn't it?" Caroline realized then that she'd stumbled into a world that defied simple judgment. These were not good men by conventional measure. But they were loyal. They were protective. They followed a code that valued family and honor above all else. They had done terrible things, would do terrible things again. But they also created pockets of safety in a city that chewed up the vulnerable and spat out their bones. Manuel found her later that night in the library, staring out the window at the compound's walls. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "Having all the thoughts," Caroline admitted. "Your world is complicated." "It's brutal," Manuel corrected. "Don't romanticize it. We do what we do because someone has to, and because we're already damned anyway. But we also protect what's ours. And you're ours now, Caroline, whether you like it or not. Those children love you. My men respect you. Even Antonio's coming around." He moved closer, and she could feel the heat of him, the controlled violence always coiled beneath the surface. "You don't have to understand it all. You don't have to approve. You just have to be safe. Let me give you that." Caroline turned to face him. This dangerous man who had somehow become her protector. "People aren't their worst moments," she said, echoing Father Tomas's words. "Is that true for me too? For someone who's been nothing but a victim, a failure, someone who couldn't save herself?" Manuel's expression softened. "You saved my children when you couldn't save yourself. That makes you the bravest person in this compound." He reached out slowly, giving her time to move away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Welcome to the family, Caroline. God help us all." The tutoring started as something to occupy Caroline's hands and mind while her body finished healing. Raphael and Sophia had been out of school since their mother's death 3 years ago, taught by a rotating cast of tutors who never lasted more than a few months. They were bright children, Caroline discovered, but emotionally locked down in ways that broke her heart. They answered questions in monotone voices. They completed assignments with mechanical precision. They never laughed. So Caroline stopped teaching them from textbooks and started teaching them how to feel again. She brought art supplies to their lessons, cheap watercolors and construction paper that Manuel's people procured with the same efficiency they'd used to acquire weapons. "Paint me something that makes you angry," she told them that first day. Raphael stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. "It's okay to be angry," Caroline said gently. "Your mama died. That's not fair. It's okay to be furious about it. Raphael painted in black and red, violent slashes across the paper that gradually took shape. A car, flames, a woman's silhouette. When he finished, tears were streaming down his face. Caroline didn't tell him it would be okay. She just sat beside him and said, "Yes. Exactly. That's how it feels." Sophia painted her mother as an angel with broken wings, and Caroline understood that this child carried guilt no 4-year-old should bear, some twisted belief that if she'd been better, her mother might have stayed. They talked about it over cookies Caroline taught them to bake, simple sugar cookies that filled the kitchen with warmth, and the kind of ordinary magic that had been missing from this house of stone and soldiers. Manuel watched from doorways, silent and still, as his children slowly came back to life. He was there the day Sophia laughed, actually laughed, when flour exploded across the counter and dusted her face white. He saw the way Raphael's shoulders lost some of their rigid tension when Caroline read to them at night, doing all the character voices, making stories come alive. He heard them chattering at breakfast, asking questions, making jokes, being children instead of small broken adults trying to survive in a world that had already hurt them too much. "How did you do this?" he asked Caroline one afternoon, his voice carrying something that might have been wonder. "They haven't laughed since Isabella died. The therapist said it would take years. You did it in weeks." Caroline looked at the children playing in the garden, their voices bright and clear. "I didn't fix them," she said. "I just showed them it was safe to be broken. That they didn't have to be strong all the time. That someone would hold them while they fell apart." That night, Sophia's screams woke the entire compound. Caroline reached her first, found the little girl thrashing in her sheets, trapped in some nightmare landscape where monsters wore human faces and mothers disappeared into fire. Caroline gathered her close, rocking her, singing, "You Are My Sunshine," in a voice that still cracked on the high notes. Manuel burst through the door seconds later, weapon drawn, ready to kill whatever threatened his daughter. He found Caroline instead, holding Sophia against her chest, humming softly. His face was wild with panic and helplessness. A man who could order executions without flinching, but couldn't stop his daughter's nightmares. "What do I do?" he asked, and Caroline heard the desperation beneath the words. "How do I protect her from this?" "You can't," Caroline said gently, still rocking Sophia as her sobs quieted. "You can't protect them from grief or fear or the memories that come in the dark. That's not how this works." She met his eyes over Sophia's head. "Don't just protect them from the monsters, Manuel. Teach them they're stronger than the monsters. Teach them that fear is something you feel and survive, not something that breaks you." Something shifted in Manuel's expression as he watched her with his daughter. He sat down beside them on the bed, uncertain and human in a way Caroline had never seen. Sophia reached for him without opening her eyes, and he took her small hand in his scarred one with a tenderness that made Caroline's throat tight. They stayed like that until Sophia fell back asleep, two broken adults keeping watch over a broken child. All of them trying to figure out how to heal. Later, much later, Caroline found herself awake and restless, the compound too quiet, her thoughts too loud. She wandered to the kitchen and found Manuel already there, sitting in darkness with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. "Can't sleep either?" she asked, and he shook his head. She poured herself water and sat across from him, comfortable in the silence that stretched between them. "Isabella," he said finally, the name rough in his throat. "My wife. The children's mother. She was killed by a car bomb meant for me. I'd been getting threats from the Moretti family. My security wanted me to use an armored vehicle. I refused." His hands tightened on the glass. "She took the kids to school that morning. I was supposed to go, but I had a meeting. She kissed me goodbye and told me she loved me, and 3 hours later she was gone. The children saw it happen. Raphael remembers everything. Sophia was too young, but she knows. Children always know." Caroline didn't offer meaningless comfort. Didn't tell him it wasn't his fault, or that time heals all wounds, or any of the other lies people tell to fill the silence around grief. She just said, "I'm sorry. That's a terrible weight to carry." "What's yours?" Manuel asked quietly. "What's the weight you carry?" So Caroline told him. About her parents dying when she was 12. Carbon monoxide leak, just went to sleep and never woke up. About the foster homes, Some kind, most not, all temporary. About her grandmother taking her in at 16. The only person who ever truly loved her, dying from cancer when Caroline was 21. About Richard Holloway and the others before him. Men who saw her desperation and used it, who taught her that asking for help meant giving away pieces of yourself you could never get back. I learned that I was only worth what I could give people, Caroline said, staring at her hands. That love was always conditional. That the moment I stopped being useful or stopped saying yes or stopped sacrificing myself, I'd be thrown away. So when I saw those children in the snow, I didn't think. I just gave them what I had, because that's all I've ever known how to do. Manuel reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch was careful, respectful, asking permission even as it offered comfort. You're not a victim, he said. You're a warrior who survived battles I never even knew existed. You fought with no weapons, no army, no power, just yourself. And you won. You're still here. Caroline looked at him, this dangerous man with gentle hands and eyes full of ghosts, and felt something shift in her chest. Not love, not yet, but recognition. One wounded soul seeing another. Healing isn't linear, she whispered. Some days you're fine. Some days you fall apart. The trick is learning that falling apart doesn't mean you're broken beyond repair. Then we'll learn together, Manuel said. And in the darkness of that kitchen, surrounded by stone walls and armed guards and all the complicated violence of his world, Caroline thought maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where her brokenness was allowed to exist without shame. Where she could be seen, truly seen, and not be found wanting. Caroline had spent too many years reading the micro-expressions of dangerous men not to recognize when something was wrong. It started small. Guards positioned in hallways that should have been empty. Security rotations that didn't match the patterns she'd unconsciously memorized over weeks in the compound. Doors she remembered locking found open in the morning. Conversations that died abruptly when she rounded corners, leaving only guilty silence and eyes that wouldn't meet hers. She tried to dismiss it as paranoia, the hypervigilance of someone who'd survived by learning to see threats before they materialized. But her instincts screamed danger in a language she'd learned to trust more than logic. She found Manuel in his office reviewing shipping manifests, the legitimate business that fronted for everything else. Something's wrong, she said without preamble. Someone in your organization is working against you. Manuel looked up, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder. What makes you think that? Caroline detailed what she'd noticed, watching his face close off with each observation. When she finished, he set down his pen with deliberate care. Caroline, I appreciate your concern, but my men have been with me for years. Antonio vets everyone personally. If there was a traitor, we'd know. You didn't know about the attack in the parking garage, Caroline said quietly. Someone told Victor Russo exactly when and where I'd be vulnerable. That was different. That was... Manuel stopped, something flickering across his face. Doubt, maybe. Or the beginning of belief. I've spent my entire adult life surviving men who wanted to hurt me, Caroline said. I learned to read rooms, to sense danger, to know when someone's intentions don't match their words. I'm telling you, someone in this house is wrong. I can feel it. But Manuel was already shaking his head, and Caroline recognized the look, male pride, the refusal to believe a woman with no formal training could see what his sophisticated security apparatus had missed. She left his office feeling the familiar sting of not being heard, of being dismissed as hysterical or paranoid or both. 2 days later, she was proven right in the worst possible way. She'd gone looking for Raphael, who'd left his favorite book in the library. The compound was quiet in that late afternoon way, most of the men out on various errands, the children supposedly napping. She heard voices from Antonio's office, raised angry wrong. She recognized Antonio's voice, and another that made her skin crawl though she couldn't say why. Benicio, Antonio's most trusted lieutenant, a man who'd been with the family since before Isabella's death. Caroline moved closer, her heart hammering, and heard words that turned her blood cold. Should have died in that car, not her. You were supposed to be driving that day. Victor paid me good money to put you in the ground, and instead... The crash of furniture. A gunshot, deafening in the enclosed space. Caroline's body moved before her mind could catch up. Throwing open the door to find Antonio on the floor bleeding from his leg, Benicio standing over him with a gun. "You," Benicio snarled when he saw her, swinging the weapon toward her face. "Always where you shouldn't be. Always watching. Victor was right, you're the key to breaking Manuel. If I bring him your body, he'll—" Antonio lunged from the floor, grabbing for Benicio's gun arm. They grappled, both men's hands on the weapon. Caroline saw the knife on Benicio's belt, saw him reaching for it with his free hand, saw the angle that would put the blade directly into Antonio's throat. She didn't think. Didn't calculate odds or consider consequences. She just moved. Caroline threw herself forward, her hands grabbing for the knife, her body becoming a shield between Benicio and Antonio. She felt the blade punch into her shoulder, hot and wrong, felt her vision white out with pain. But her momentum carried her into Benicio, knocking him off balance, buying precious seconds. Seconds that Manuel's men used to flood through the door, weapons drawn, voices shouting. They subdued Benicio with brutal efficiency, slamming him to the ground, zip-tying his hands while he screamed curses and threats. Caroline didn't see it. She was on her knees, blood spreading across her shirt, the world tilting sideways in a way that suggested shock. Antonio was pressing his hands against her wound, his face pale, saying things she couldn't quite hear over the ringing in her ears. Then Manuel was there, his hands replacing Antonio's, his voice cutting through the chaos with absolute authority. "Medic! Now! And someone get Father Tomas, Antonio's been shot." His eyes found Caroline's and she saw something break open in them, something raw and terrified. "Why did you do that? Why did you put yourself between?" "Had to," Caroline managed, her voice thin. "He would have killed Antonio. Couldn't let that happen. They're your family. She couldn't finish, wasn't sure what she'd been about to say. The medic arrived, started working on her shoulder with practiced hands. Through the haze of pain and shock, Caroline heard Benicio's confession being extracted. The money from Victor Russo, the years of feeding information, his role in planting the car bomb that killed Isabella. He'd been the ghost in the machine all along, invisible because he'd been there so long no one thought to suspect him. Manuel never left Caroline's side as the medic worked. His hands were covered in her blood, his expression shattered. When the immediate crisis passed, when the bleeding was controlled and Antonio was being treated for the through and through in his thigh, Manuel finally spoke. "You saved my brother's life," he said, his voice rough. "You saw what we couldn't see. You warned me and I didn't listen. And when it mattered, you didn't hesitate. You threw yourself into danger for someone you barely know." Caroline tried to shrug and regretted it immediately as pain lanced through her shoulder. "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," she said, echoing something her grandmother had once told her. "It's being absolutely terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway." Manuel's hand found hers, careful of her injuries. "You're one of us now. Not because I said so, but because you've proven it. You protect this family as fiercely as any soldier I've ever commanded. More fiercely, maybe, because you do it out of choice, not obligation." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "Loyalty can't be demanded. It can't be bought. It's earned through consistent character, through showing up when it matters. And you, Caroline Brooks, have shown up in ways I'm only beginning to understand." Antonio, bandaged and pale but alive, limped over to where she sat. "Thank you," he said simply. "I was wrong about you. I thought you were using us. I thought you were too soft to survive in this world. I was an idiot." "You were protecting your family," Caroline said. "That's not idiotic. That's love." Later, after the chaos settled and Benicio had been taken somewhere Caroline deliberately didn't ask about, she found herself in the medical room with Manuel keeping vigil beside her bed. She was drifting on painkillers, the edges of the world soft and distant. "You could have died today," Manuel said quietly. "Again. That's twice now you've nearly died protecting my family." "Didn't die either time," Caroline pointed out. "I'm harder to kill than I look. I'm starting to understand that." Manuel leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You're the strongest person I've ever met, and you don't even see it. You think you're weak because you needed help, because you were vulnerable. But strength isn't never falling down. It's getting back up. It's protecting others even when you're terrified. It's surviving with grace. Caroline's eyes were closing, exhaustion and medication pulling her under. The last thing she felt was Manuel's hand in hers, warm and steady, anchoring her to a world where maybe finally she belonged. Manuel tended to Caroline's wound every morning with hands that had broken bones and ended lives, now moving with a gentleness that made her throat tight. He cleaned the knife wound with careful precision, changed the dressings with steady fingers, monitored for infection with the focused intensity he brought to everything that mattered to him. "You don't have to do this," Caroline said on the third morning, watching him work. "You have people for this. Doctors. Nurses. I need to," Manuel interrupted quietly. His fingers brushed the edge of the wound, checking for heat, for the red streaks that would signal infection. "You took this blade for my brother. For my family. The least I can do is make sure you heal properly." There was something in his voice that went deeper than obligation. Something raw and almost tender that made Caroline's walls tremble. She'd spent so long protecting herself, building fortifications around her heart, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be cared for without strings attached. Sophia brought her drawings every afternoon. Elaborate crayon creations that she explained in breathless detail. "This is our house," she announced one day, pointing to a colorful rectangle with too many windows. "That's Papa, and that's Raphael, and that's Lucia, and that's you." She'd drawn Caroline in purple, holding both children's hands, a crown on her head. "You're the queen of keeping us safe." "I'm not a queen, sweetheart," Caroline said, her voice catching. "You are to us," Sophia insisted with the absolute certainty of a child who knew her own mind. Raphael was quieter, more careful with his questions. He sat beside Caroline's bed one evening while she read to him, his small shoulder pressed against hers. When the story ended, he didn't move, just stared at his hands and asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "Are you going to stay? Forever, I mean." The question pierced through every defense Caroline had left. She wanted to say yes immediately, to give this serious little boy the certainty he craved. But she'd learned the hard way that promises were fragile things, easily broken. "I want to," she said honestly. "But forever is complicated." "Mama said she'd stay forever," Raphael said. Then she didn't. Not because she wanted to leave, but because bad things happened. He looked up at her with eyes too old for his face. "I know bad things might happen again. I just want to know if you'll try to stay. If you want to be here." Caroline pulled him close, careful of her healing shoulder. "I want to be here," she said. "I want to be with you and Sophia and your papa. I want that more than I've wanted anything in a very long time." "Then that's enough," Raphael said simply. "Wanting to stay is enough." But later that night, when the compound was quiet and the children were asleep, Caroline found herself in the library, unable to shake the fear that had been growing since Raphael's question. Manuel found her there, standing at the window looking out at the walls that kept this family safe and simultaneously trapped them. "Can't sleep?" he asked, and she shook her head. "I'm afraid," Caroline admitted, the words tasting like failure. "I'm afraid I'll believe this is real, that you care, that the children need me, that I have a place here. I'm afraid I'll let myself hope, and then it'll be taken away like everything else. Because that's what always happens. I find something good and the world reminds me I'm not allowed to keep it." Manuel moved closer, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but he didn't touch her. "I'm afraid too," he said, his voice low and rough. "I'm afraid I'll fail you the way I failed Isabella. That my world, my choices, my enemies will destroy another person He stopped, swallowed hard. "I'm afraid that letting you into our lives means painting a target on your back. That loving you means eventually burying you." Caroline turned to face him, and the vulnerability in his expression stole her breath. This man who commanded empires and inspired fear in his enemies looked absolutely terrified of the possibility of loss. "But I'm more afraid of not trying," Manuel continued. "More afraid of letting fear make my choices. Of looking back in 10 years and regretting that I didn't have the courage to reach for something real." His hand came up slowly, giving her time to move away, and cupped her face with devastating gentleness. "You're not a victim to be saved, Caroline. You're a warrior who survived impossible battles. You're brave and strong, and you've taught my children how to laugh again. You've made this house feel like a home instead of a fortress." "I don't know how to do this," Caroline whispered. "I don't know how to let someone in. How to trust that you won't." "Neither do I," Manuel said. "I've been closed off since Isabella died. Couldn't let anyone close because closeness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk. But you're already close. You're already family. The question is whether we're brave enough to admit what we both feel." Caroline's breath caught. "What do we feel?" "That we're broken in complementary ways," Manuel said. "That maybe two damaged people can build something real together. That love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone willing to be imperfect together." He leaned in slowly, telegraphing his intention, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Caroline didn't pull away. She met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it wasn't passionate or consuming. It was careful. Tentative. Like two people holding something infinitely fragile and infinitely precious, terrified of breaking it, but unwilling to let it go. The kiss lasted only seconds, but when they pulled apart, something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't the beginning of a fairy tale where true love conquered all. This was messier, more honest, more real. This was two people who had every reason to never trust again, choosing to try anyway. "I can't promise you perfect," Manuel said, his forehead resting against hers. "I can't promise you safe, though God knows I'll try. But I can promise you honest. I can promise you seen. I can promise that whatever comes, we'll face it together." Caroline's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. "That's more than I've ever had," she said. "More than I thought I'd ever get to want." "Then let's be brave enough to want it," Manuel said. "Let's be brave enough to try." Sophia's drawing was still on the table, their family rendered in bright crayons, everyone holding hands, everyone smiling. Caroline looked at it and thought maybe, just maybe, she could learn to believe in the permanence of good things. Maybe she could learn that being known, truly known, scars and all, didn't have to mean being rejected. Maybe intimacy didn't have to equal pain. Maybe it could equal this. Two broken people choosing each other, not despite their damage but including it. Making space for each other's fears and wounds, and still saying yes to the terrifying possibility of love. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real. And real, Caroline was beginning to understand, was better than any fantasy she could have imagined. Manuel tended to Caroline's wound every morning with hands that had broken bones and ended lives, now moving with a gentleness that made her throat tight. He cleaned the knife wound with careful precision, changed the dressings with steady fingers, monitored for infection with the focused intensity he brought to everything that mattered to him. "You don't have to do this," Caroline said on the third morning, watching him work. "You have people for this. Doctors. Nurses. You're—" "I need to," Manuel interrupted quietly. His fingers brushed the edge of the wound, checking for heat, for the red streaks that would signal infection. "You took this blade for my brother. For my family. The least I can do is make sure you heal properly." There was something in his voice that went deeper than obligation. Something raw and almost tender that made Caroline's walls tremble. She'd spent so long protecting herself, building fortifications around her heart, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be cared for without strings attached. Sophia brought her drawings every afternoon. Elaborate crayon creations that she explained in breathless detail. "This is our house," she announced one day, pointing to a colorful rectangle with too many windows. "That's Papa, and that's Raphael, and that's Lucia, and that's you." She'd drawn Caroline in purple, holding both children's hands, a crown on her head. "You're the queen of keeping us safe." "I'm not a queen, sweetheart," Caroline said, her voice catching. "You are to us," Sophia insisted with the absolute certainty of a child who knew her own mind. Raphael was quieter, more careful with his questions. He sat beside Caroline's bed one evening while she read to him, his small shoulder pressed against hers. When the story ended, he didn't move, just stared at his hands and asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "Are you going to stay? Forever, I mean?" The question pierced through every defense Caroline had left. She wanted to say yes immediately, to give this serious little boy the certainty he craved. But she'd learned the hard way that promises were fragile things, Easily broken. I want to, she said honestly. But forever is complicated. Mama said she'd stay forever, Raphael said. Then she didn't. Not because she wanted to leave, but because bad things happened. He looked up at her with eyes too old for his face. I know bad things might happen again. I just want to know if you'll try to stay. If you want to be here. Caroline pulled him close, careful of her healing shoulder. I want to be here, she said. I want to be with you and Sophia and your papa. I want that more than I've wanted anything in a very long time. Then that's enough, Raphael said simply. Wanting to stay is enough. But later that night, when the compound was quiet and the children were asleep, Caroline found herself in the library unable to shake the fear that had been growing since Raphael's question. Manuel found her there, standing at the window looking out at the walls that kept this family safe and simultaneously trapped them. Can't sleep? He asked, and she shook her head. I'm afraid, Caroline admitted, the words tasting like failure. I'm afraid I'll believe this is real. That you care, that the children need me, that I have a place here. I'm afraid I'll let myself hope. And then it'll be taken away like everything else. Because that's what always happens. I find something good, and the world reminds me I'm not allowed to keep it. Manuel moved closer. Close enough that she could feel his warmth, but he didn't touch her. I'm afraid too, he said, his voice low and rough. I'm afraid I'll fail you the way I failed Isabella. That my world, my choices, my enemies will destroy another person He stopped, swallowed hard. I'm afraid that letting you into our lives means painting a target on your back. That loving you means eventually burying you. Caroline turned to face him, and the vulnerability in his expression stole her breath. This man who commanded empires and inspired fear in his enemies looked absolutely terrified of the possibility of loss. But I'm more afraid of not trying, Manuel continued. More afraid of letting fear make my choices. Of looking back in 10 years and regretting that I didn't have the courage to reach for something real. His hand came up slowly, giving her time to move away, and cupped her face with devastating gentleness. You're not a victim to be saved, Caroline. You're a warrior who survived impossible battles. You're brave and strong, and you've taught my children how to laugh again. You've made this house feel like a home instead of a fortress. I don't know how to do this, Caroline whispered. I don't know how to let someone in. How to trust that you won't. Neither do I, Manuel said. I've been closed off since Isabella died. Couldn't let anyone close because closeness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk. But you're already close. You're already family. The question is whether we're brave enough to admit what we both feel. Caroline's breath caught. What do we feel? That we're broken in complementary ways, Manuel said. That maybe two damaged people can build something real together. That love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone willing to be imperfect together. He leaned in slowly, telegraphing his intention, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Caroline didn't pull away. She met him halfway. And when their lips touched, it wasn't passionate or consuming. It was careful. Tentative. Like two people holding something infinitely fragile and infinitely precious. Terrified of breaking it, but unwilling to let it go. The kiss lasted only seconds. But when they pulled apart, something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't the beginning of a fairy tale where true love conquered all. This was messier, more honest, more real. This was two people who had every reason to never trust again, choosing to try anyway. I can't promise you perfect, Manuel said, his forehead resting against hers. I can't promise you safe, though God knows I'll try. But I can promise you honest. I can promise you seen. I can promise that whatever comes, we'll face it together. Caroline's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. That's more than I've ever had, she said. More than I thought I'd ever get to want. Then let's be brave enough to want it, Manuel said. Let's be brave enough to try. Sophia's drawing was still on the table, their family rendered in bright crayons, everyone holding hands, everyone smiling. Caroline looked at it and thought maybe, just maybe, she could learn to believe in the permanence of good things. Maybe she could learn that being known, truly known, scars and all, didn't have to mean being rejected. Maybe intimacy didn't have to equal pain. Maybe it could equal this. Two broken people choosing each other, not despite their damage but including it, making space for each other's fears and wounds, and still saying yes to the terrifying possibility of love. It wasn't a fairy tale, but it was real. And real, Caroline was beginning to understand, was better than any fantasy she could have imagined.